Good morning to everyone. And during a biophysics experiment performed, by the way, what I'm going to say has been written by Professor Piantelli. He's very sorry for not being here, but I will try to be as close as possible to his ideas that he shared with me. During a biophysics experiment performed in August 1989 in an environment containing hydrogen gas and in the presence of a very pure nickel foil, we observed an excess heat which could not be explained by the supplied electric power. The electric power was introduced by means of two terminals welded to the outer edges of the plate. In the following years, we performed many other experiments in order to verify the first observation, and we obtained a lot of emissions of thermal energy and of different kind of radiation too. Hundreds of experiments have made the anomalous phenomenon reproducible. In this presentation, we present the current state of the research, which at present is only research, and it can be translated in a few months into industrial products. Moreover, we present a possible path in order to develop this intriguing and very complex research area. It is not still possible to attribute a specific name to the anomalous phenomenon. In fact, even if there are many evidences collected by the many researchers in a lot of important laboratories, the final and key experiment able to clarify all the aspects is still lacking. The final experiment must assure the necessary and absolutely essential self-consistency of all the results, as it is required by the 4 rules of Galileo, the founder of the scientific method. The existence of the anomalous phenomenon is now out of doubt, because there is a very big amount of absolutely irrefutable and unassailable experimental data. Whilst 23 years ago it was easy to refute because there were not yet self-consistent and repeatable results, and the proposed explanation, if they were correct from the mathematical point of view, could be attributed more to fantasy rather than known and experimentally tested facts, today it is pathological to deny all the results which were seen and measured. For example, it is necessary to explain how it is possible that charged particle that you can see here is one and here a bigger one, with energies greater than 6 MeV photographed in the cloud chamber can be emitted by a simple metal rod just after extraction from the cell. Where gamma photons with energies of the order of several MeV come from, detected by germanium spectrometer and other machines. Here you can see this line, sorry for the mouse, this is the background, these are the measured data, this one above, and this is the difference between the two. This one over here is just a zoom of this little part, and over here also is possible to see a difference between the background and the measurement. The lower part of the slide shows the photon emission spectrum. This is still a zoom of this part. Principle is the same, background against the measured. This is a photon emission spectrum for 5 weeks. This is week number 1, week number 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it's possible to see how things are changing in the time. Another evidence of the anomalous spectrum is over here, where you see a big difference between background and measured emissions. And this is another slide. Here you can find another peak of the gold activated by neutrons and some background spectra. So where these neutrons detected by means of helium-3 detector and activated by gold foil at the same time come from? Even if this fact, fortunately for us, took place only sporadically during some ignition experiments with very low flow. Here you can find another detail of the region around 411 keV and neutrons emission revealed by the helium-3 detector. These, of course, are minutes and counts. So, where the activity, quite low, of the samples extracted immediately after the experiments come from? This activity disappeared in about 2 months. This is a rod that we use in one of our experiments, in which you can see 2 different regions. The detection of elements and substances which weren't present inside the cell at the beginning of the experiments and which were found in considerable amount, measured by XRF technique and other methods, when the rods were extracted from the cell in which anomalous phenomenon took place. These intruder elements were observed only in activated regions, while at the edges of the nickel rod, where the primer didn't take place, only pure nickel is present. I'm going to explain you a little bit about this semi-redox analysis of the surface of the nickel rod. Here you find 2 graphs, graph number A and B. Here you see point number 1 and 2. So graph number A relates to point number 1, where the anomalous phenomenon didn't take place, and point number 2 is related to graph B. You can see how the spectrum detected on the rod surface in point number 2 in a region where there was energy production has been measured by means of the temperature on the external cell surface. So you can see how different these graphs are and how many different components are present in the second graph. To all these measurements, we have to add also the production of thermal energy. These are other experiments that we perform in our laboratory. Here you can see a typical cell activation. So in red you see the temperature inside the cell minus the ambient temperature, of course, and in blue the inlet power. You can see that with an inlet power of 38 watts, the temperature before the ignition was between 218 and 219. After the ignition, we had an increase of temperature and a decrease of inlet power. This is basically the same kind of experiment with different temperature. Here we have about 100 degrees of difference between the two. Let me check the timing. These experiments took about 55 days. So here is about 55 days. This means a lot because usually in these kind of experiments it's pretty, I wouldn't say easy, but it's pretty common to have some effect, but it's rather difficult having this effect for a long time. And 55 days can be considered long. This is another kind of activation, initial chemical physical energy production put into evidence. We use this test to show that it's possible to have a significant amount of energy emitted by the cell in the very early stage. We consider this effect not as a nuclear effect, but as a chemical physical effect, because it just doesn't last. In our experiments, we try to make this effect as small as possible. In fact, you can see this little up here, which correspond in another cell activation to this big peak. Then, this is probably the most interesting graph that I will show you. To all these measurements, we have to add also the production of thermal energy in large quantities, of the order of megajoule, in cells, which kept on working for tens of months without adding gas, and in the case of the last experiments, which is not this one, also without introducing electrical supply or others. This fact is, of course, the most relevant fact from the point of view of industrial applications. This should be necessary, therefore, to explain how it is possible that this cell of about 1 kilogram stayed at 300 degrees without any adding gas and external energy for some months. On the right, here in black, you see the taratura, the setup of the temperature sensor. And after the setup, we went back at this point, giving about 30 watts to our cell. Then we started the process, bringing the cell from 150 degrees to about 400 degrees, and then we made several procedures on our cell, and we were able to reduce the energy, inlet energy, going left, without reducing also a little bit the temperature of the cell, and in the end we were able to bring the cell at 300 degrees, because you have to add the ambient temperature in this graph, with almost no inlet power. This point is not at zero because we considered the energy spent for the Piantelli to check the temperature. But anyway, no inlet power was given to warm the cell. During a primer with a suitable power supply system of the platinum resistance, which we use in these experiments, and the platinum resistance increases its electrical resistance linearly with temperature. With stabilized constant voltage, we see the temperature rise almost instantly, even up 100 degrees, and introduce current decrease. This is more easy to see in this kind of graphs over here. So we see that introduce power decrease after the temperature increase is a consequence of the platinum resistance. And also the current decreases of more than 1 ampere. It can be seen that the input power decreases while the temperature rises. Moreover, the temperature remains around the reached value for months with fluctuation smaller than 5%. These are some of the experimental results obtained and published in 23 years of work. Now it is necessary to perform the most difficult and key experiment. About this we had a lot of delays, partly due to the complexity of the phenomenon, and partly due to the chronic lack of the necessary instrumentation capable to detect in a correct way all the numerous parameters. In these 23 years, there were many researchers, more than 160, and theorists who tried to explain the phenomenon with very free spirit and imagination, to identify a mathematical path in order to find the source of the facts and the results. In order to clarify the situation, it is necessary to refer again to Galileo and his rule. The first rule is the sensata esperienza, sensible experience, which must be repeatable. If the experiment is not repeatable, then there's no internal consistency. The second rule concerns intuition and assumption, axioms, which must respect some limitation to be possible and acceptable. We look at the results obtained in many labs. We can see that there are at least 3 groups of very intriguing experimental results, all of them repeatedly found together in almost all the experiments. These results, obtained in many labs, not only our labs of course, can be summarized in an excess of thermal energy with respect to simple chemical physical reactions. In this case, it is necessary to remove this simple chemical physical reaction, as we did and as I showed you before. Otherwise, one can see what is not, as happened recently. It is important to know that those parasites phenomena take place both in gas and electrochemical experiments. Alpha particle detection simultaneously with the excess energy production. Detection of new elements which weren't present in the sample before the experiments. Other more sporadic facts are the emission of a few, thankfully, neutrons, X or gamma photons. Other measurements, such as the activity after sample extraction, seem maybe less important for a first approach, even if the detection of charged particles both during the experiments and after the sample extraction are not a secondary aspect. Every explanation attempt must interpret all the described results without exception. Moreover, it is necessary that the starting hypotheses are real and not just fantasy. An example based on physics laws and quantum mechanics statements, in particular conservation laws. For example, a violation of a principle of conservation can be accepted if a new particle or a new situation is assumed. It is necessary that this new particle or situation is experimentally detected without any doubt. The lack of experimental verification, even in presence of a correct and perfect mathematical path and description, is a sign of inconsistency. Questo mondo non ha da essere un pezzo di carta, diceva Galileo. This world should not be a world of paper. To give you some example, an explanation based on weak interaction must show where the necessary energy comes from, and all must be experimentally detected. An explanation based on strong interaction or similar must explain how it is possible to overcome the high potential barrier and why the characteristic products are lacking. An explanation based on a new cluster among atoms or nuclei must explain why these clusters were never seen or detected, beside the lacking of the typical products. An explanation based on weak interaction must show where the necessary energy comes from and why the typical particles were never detected. Every hypothesis must be always experimentally verified. The complexity of the anomalous phenomenon can be deducted from a short list of some of the parameters we have to study. The transition metals involved, the minimum working temperature, which depends on the metal, the maximum temperature beyond which the phenomenon stops because of the destruction of the essential conditions, the primer action modes and the star technique, the pressure modulation of the hydrogen, the best and suitable geometry for the cell, structure, size and stability of the used metal, and more. The complexity of the process requires a systematic and well-coordinated study among the researchers in labs equipped with the necessary instrumentation to perform measurements before, during, and after the experiments. And I can tell you that some of these instrumentation still have to be built. They are simply not present in the market. We have to think about something. As an example of the difficulties during the process, elements with short life, about 81 seconds, are produced. As a consequence, it is necessary to perform a measurement in a very short time, up to 10 minutes, after extraction of the sample from the cell. If we want to detect them, of course. The difficulty of the necessary measurement requires quality detectors. As a consequence, it is not possible to perform this kind of experiment in a garage or in a cupboard, as has happened in the recent past. Expensive detectors are therefore necessary. As a consequence, it is not possible to reach the goal of understanding the anomalous phenomenon with some more or less improvised cell. For the same reason, it is not possible to produce a commercial product without the necessary knowledge of all the parameters ruling the anomalous phenomenon. All these things send away the goal. These so complex studies and investigations are not possible for an improvised laboratory. In order to face the problem, it is necessary to create a large group of qualified researchers who decide that a common working program, in example, a well-calibrated project including many correlated experiments, each facing a different aspect of the problem. The obtained result should be discussed all together, as usual, for research projects in physics. The critical number of researchers necessary to solve this problem is so high that it is not possible to think that each one can solve it all alone. It is not possible to reach the goal with claimed repetition of the experiments in different labs. Too many parameters, and not all of them have been discovered and identified. It is better to coordinate complementary self-consistent experiments. The fundamental thing is the internal consistency of the results. It is not possible to repeat a so complex experiment without knowing all the ranges of all the used parameters. Many experiments performed in special laboratories are unique, and they can't be reproducible in other laboratories because of the complexity and expense of the instrumentation. In our case, the complexity and the large amount of parameters make this repetition very difficult and complex, at least up to now. From the analysis of the results collected in 23 years, it is possible to think to a positive connection between this research field with some of the unsolved problems and incomplete problems in fission plants. Due to the complexity of the problems, we can also cite the possibility of a comparative study taking to the reduction of some problems, as nuclear waste, related to the future chain of subcritical systems. Concerning the research field directly to abnormal phenomena, the problem of unwise claims and carelessness technology, the desire to be at the limelight at all costs, can take us back 50 years. When the business won and fission plants started to be built, even if the necessary studies to make safe and reliable plants were not enough really developed. Now, similar effect is taking place in this field of research because someone wants the product at every cost, even if the scientific and technical knowledge are scarce and very approximate. The media pressure is very high on us and improvident because it creates unrealistic expectation with unpredictable consequences on the possible developments. Nobody knows how the working cycle is long, and someone wants to put it inside houses and industrial plants. I don't know how someone can buy a product without knowing the duration and the amount of producing energy. Thank you for your attention. I hope I answered some of your questions and have satisfied some of your curiosity.